So we're going to take you on a short tour of the cemetery. Now, there's going to be a ton of stories told, and some of you will know most of the stories, but we might give you one or two new ones that you haven't heard before, and that's okay. And if you want to add some stories to this, that's fine too. And Eric, it'd be great if you could keep recording this. It'd be fabulous, because we probably have sort of arranged that. So we're going to start with some basic Canadian history. So John Graves Simcoe was made the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada in 1791. He came here in 1792 with his aide, a guy named Peter Russell. Now, Russell's wife was best friends with a lady named Sophia Denison, who was married to Captain John Denison. And Russell and his sister, actually Russell's wife, it was Russell's sister, worked on the Denisons to convince them to come to the opening up of this new section of Upper Canada and to set up shop in Kingston, which they did in 1792. Now, Denison started off trying to open up a brewery, which after a couple of years began to falter and fail, and so Denison started to make noises about heading back to England. Now, Simcoe and Russell were the ultimate marketing guys and said, look, we cannot afford to have people go back to England and spread the word that there's failure if you go to the Upper Canada. You might not actually make it and be successful. So they turned around and said, what if we gave you some opportunities at the far end of the lake where we're opening up this new colony? Would that keep you here? So Denison agreed on one proviso. He asked the question, what are you going to call this place? And the story came back, and it's actually well documented in an article in Maclean's magazine from 1913 that says that he was told that Simcoe and Russell were thinking of calling it Dublin. And
New Dublin.
New Dublin? I heard Dublin. But anyway, Dublin. And the Denison responded back, well, as a good Yorkshireman, there's no way I'm going to do that. So Simcoe said, what do you want to call it? And of course, York was given as the answer. But that decision to call it York drove a lot of names for other places in the area. Scarborough, the Don River, the Humber River, other parts of that were driven because of that decision to name the city after, or the settlement after York. By the way, this article is scanned and available on our website, which, if you're not aware of where that website is, you can contact me or Denny, denisonfamily.on.ca. Now, when he got here, Denison set up camp at Castle Frank, which is just where the Don River meets Bloor Street today, and there it was there in 1801 rather, that his young daughter Elizabeth passed away, and she was buried at the property at Castle Frank. Now, somewhere between 1796, when he arrived, and 1804, probably around 1798, he acquired a whole bunch of farmland, and we're standing on it right now. So from here, the maps, we can show you in a bit, maps that show where the extent of the farmland. There were actually 3 plots that were acquired up here. Now, eventually, closer to 1804, he moved up here and established the burial property, which is where we are now, and had Elizabeth moved from Castle Frank to here. So Elizabeth was the first one. And over the ensuing years, others were buried here as well, such as his wife's parents were buried here, and Tim will talk about that in a few moments. Now, when he died in 1824, his will stated that he wanted to have this piece of the property carved off into a family burial ground. And the will actually has that all laid out. Again, it's something that's documented well in our Chronicles documents on the website. And it says that the fence be kept in good and substantial repair, which I think we've done a pretty good job to do that. And then in 1853, the property was consecrated by being deeded to the Archbishop or the Archdiocese of Toronto. Now, let's put some historical context on who we've got here. So during his time in the early 1800s, the War of 1812 happened. So there was a garrison right outside town, which was the Fort York. There was uncertainty as to how Upper Canada was going to be governed. So there was a lot of stuff going on there. We had the Rebellion of 1837. So there's a whole bunch of things that were going on at the same time that drove a lot of military behavior, if you will, and beliefs into the family. And so that's why when you look at things like this article from Maclean's magazine, it's titled "The Fighting Denisons," and it's full of information and photographs and more material about our ancestors and their military records. So it's one of the things that led to our strength in service. Now, at the same time, I wanted to use that one for a second. At the same time, Toronto was growing. Now, many of you have seen this. This was produced in 1992 as part of the bicentennial, and shows a map of the city in about in the early 1800s. The orange bits indicate what was owned by the family. And so we start off with.
So here's Lake Ontario down here.
Lake Ontario's down there. Front Street's across here. This is Spadina Road across here. This is Bloor Street across here, and that's Queen Street across here. And this is Bellevue. This area over here was owned by GTD1, George Terry Denison 1, or 3 rather, was where his property, Hayden Villa, was established here. And so that's also more property from Ossington over almost to Dovercourt. There was another farm over here, and then up here is Weston. This is a different scale, but that shows the farm and including property over here. And I found another map that shows up at York Mills and Yonge Street.
Oh my!
Yes. Yeah, Richard
Lippincott
Denison had a property up there. And lastly,
so we're standing. This whole area is Weston for those from out of town.
Yes, good point. And lastly, down here, this is the corner of Front and Bay Streets. So, yeah. So the Royal York right now is just over here, and this side, the other side of across the street from the Royal York was actually an acre that was owned originally by Denison. That was the first place where they set up shop after.
So the Raptors parade yesterday.
We would have top seats.
It basically, I think, kind of went like this, and then up. Where are we here?
I think it went up University, didn't it? To the,
yes, up University.
But that's over here.
Over here. Yeah. So it went up to the new City Hall.
Right, exactly. So anyway, so that gives a little bit of a physical context of what's going on within Toronto. Now the cemetery, much of the property, all of that property was sold off over the years for development, paying bills and taxes and all kinds of other things. But the cemetery remained, and there was other property involved. Very briefly, things have changed and shifted over the years. There was property over there. We had about 4 acres on that side. There was an acre over here that were sold off for taxes at one point in time. There was some bad family feelings if you read some of the older documents about some of that when it happened in the 1920s. 1930s, we built the chapel. In 1939, the property went to the edge of the bank where the fence is now, that fence that's in good repair. But there was a dance hall down at the bottom, which was kind of a ramshackle old place, and the roadway went right across here.
Right down there.
Right down there, right by our property. So you can imagine Friday nights, Saturday nights, dance hall. So when it burned to the ground, the family got together and said, let's buy that and sort of head all this off. And so the property went from here down the banks and down into the floodplain of the river. Now, those of you who are good on your Toronto history know that 1939 is when all that happened. 1954 was Hurricane Hazel. Hurricane Hazel came along and took out all of that down there, including a street called Raymore Drive, which is right up here. 81 people were killed, most of them on Raymore Drive, and that's now been turned into a park, and it took out the dance hall. So the city expropriated most of that property. Financially, we did pretty well based on that transaction between what we paid for the property in the first place compared to what it was expropriated for from the city.
$10,000.
Yeah, good money back in those days.
And that's what's paid into the trustees.
That's right.
Correct.
We still have that 10,000, and it's now with some reinvested and some cash out about 60.
Tom Martin, our financial guy.
and trust us, the directors haven't received a penny of it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Anyway, Tim's going to take us through a little bit of a walk through the cemetery, and when we get down to the bottom, we'll talk a little bit about what's going on south of here as well. Oh yeah, I meant to talk about this. I'm sorry. Oh, thank you, Tim. That was for later on, but we'll do it now. This is a survey that we use to guide where things go in the cemetery. Sorry? Things, trees, chapels, roads, and people as well. The survey is difficult to see, but it'll be here for tonight, so have a look at it. But it is available online at the website as a scan. In fact, we have a scan not only of this, but also of the individual sections as well. And we can thank Ned for that, because he arranged for those scans to be done. The key thing I wanted to point out with this is that the layout of the cemetery is difficult to see. We're standing right here right now. So the cenotaph is over there. The chapel's over here. And and the roadway that we just came in on is right here, and the bottom of the cemetery is there, and the river is here. So that's all that side over there. So the roadway that you're seeing down here, this main line in the middle, that's the road right there that you've seen, that you know. The roadway that goes down around here and follows up along the bank, well, that's the road that goes up in front of the chapel, comes up to here. There is, however, in the survey, another road that goes down this way, which would go right down where those cars are on the other side. And that's for future expansion and for future access. And in fact, there's also an additional roadway that goes along the perimeter of the cemetery from the top here all the way down to the bottom where the property line meets up with the riverbank. So there's layouts here for future growth. I personally call all this area the soccer pitch, which I think you could use for that. But eventually that can be turned into roadways and laid out for family as well. Now, for many of the sections over here where we do have folks, this was laid out at the time of George Taylor Denison I. And it was laid out to follow the family tree. This is, I think, as a historian, pretty important, because the way it was laid out was that the descendants of Captain John and his first descendant, Thomas John, were laid out in the first two sections at the top here. So section 1N, which is right over there, right here on this map, was laid out and is called Della Hook, because John Thomas's daughter married into the Della Hook family, and that laid out that branch over there. When we go up to the section right here near this tree, 32, and I need my notes for a second here, make sure I get this right. That section is the daughter of Captain John, who married into the Taylor family. So there's a bunch of Taylor graves in that section up there. Section 31, which is one below that, right over here, is the Thomas John's eldest son, John Lawrence, who gave us the western branch of the family. So there's a whole branch over there. It's all tied up with that section as well. That's sort of the immediate descendants of Captain John, except for George Taylor Denison I, who was a prolific guy, married 4 times, lots of kids. And so they all go down here. And so we go from Charles Leslie, who was the guy who inherited much of the farm property, followed by his son, Richard Lippincott Denison, who inherited the property and then subdivided much of it. And so the Charles Leslie goes across here. That's section 1S, which is a pretty busy section because there's also portions of Dovercourt branch and a few others in there. And of course, George Taylor Denison I is buried here as well. Tim's going to show us where that is. Robert Britton Denison, that's my guy, my great-grandfather, is also buried in section 3. George Taylor Denison II, which gave us the Rusholme branch, is sections 3 and 4 down here. And this is pretty much how the layout has been specified to generally follow the family tree. So when you're looking for where you should be buried, you might want to think about trying to follow that as best you possibly can along the way. So with that, pass it over to you.
I wanted to start here because this is interesting. This was, first of all, many of you remember we had a bicentennial here in 1992. And we had 300 in attendance. The Lieutenant Governor visited, representing the Government of Ontario and the Queen. We had part of our information comes from the Chronicles. Now, this was written in 1868, right? And some of the English in it is pretty archaic and old and everything. It's hard to follow. My dad followed it up in 1969 with a more modern version and actually photographs in it. So there's a number of copies of this around. And I think if people want copies, we're going to have to probably try and get these two reproduced. There's some.
It's scanned.
It is.
That and the Richard Denison's Chronicles are also scanned.
There you go.
And they're all on the family website.
There you go. Thank you for that. So, we also made a video of this 200th anniversary of the arrival of Captain John. We had a big marquee set up here, catered food. It was a miserable cold day, if some of you remember. And Bill Denison insisted on it having a marquee. So I was on the organizing committee and we all thought, oh gee, it's expensive and so on. He says, I'm paying for it. And thank God he did, because it was freezing that day. So anyway, so this is the cenotaph. The cenotaph was erected just after World War I. The Denisons have served the crown for over 200 years. 11 Denisons have commanded the Governor General's Horse Guards. 11 of them. all served in the Fenian raids, Northwest Rebellion, Boer War, World War I, World War II. Bertram Noel Denison, I can find him,
The second
There.
one down. Yeah.
was the very first Canadian killed in the First World War.
Yeah, right up with you, right?
And this south face is the First World War. The reverse face is the Second World War. So we have no record of anybody losing their lives in the Korean conflict. And I don't think anybody's gone to Afghanistan from the family. So this is, it's interesting. And, you know, like a lot of towns, all in, for those of you out of province, a lot of towns all across Ontario and perhaps the rest of Canada have cenotaphs in them. And of course, you know, November 11th and the ceremonies happen. So let's adjourn down to the tomb of Captain John. As Richard's told you, Captain John was the first guy to come here. This box, when I was a little boy, I came here and I always wondered, what on earth is in there? We all figured it was skeletons and God knows what else. The original top had cracks in it. And the story goes that back in the Prohibition era, the bad guys that were making all their gin or whatever they made in those days used to hide it in here. And they heard the revenuers were coming, they rushed over and hid it in here and of course broke the top. That's the story. I have no idea if it's true or not. So for the 200th anniversary, we decided that the top was getting extremely hard to read, and so we raised some funds and we had this completely replaced. In fact, we even, at my insistence, we had put this at the bottom here, subsequently replaced in June 1992 to commemorate the arrival of Captain John. Now, interestingly enough, his wife, you heard of Sophia or Sophia, however we want to pronounce it, this is her stone right here. The interesting story about her is that, hang on, 1801 the daughter died and it was in Castle Frank, and this is where the body was dug up and replaced. And this stone was also hard to read in the back, so we had it redone in the front.
That's stone number 1.
Yeah, stone number 1, that's right. Okay, there is a slate one here. Well, there's the old tomb top right there. You can see it was a bit of a mess and very hard to even see now. So John Denison here, at 14 years old, he was shot and killed by his brother Charles. Now Charles used to go to Upper Canada College.
They both did.
Did they? Okay, fair enough. Even at 14?
I remember.
I don't think so. I don't think so. Anyway, Charles went back to Upper Canada after a period of mourning and apparently received some comments from the masters. Now, I know what it was like to be at Upper Canada in the old days. It was pretty brutal at times. But anyway, George Taylor Denison II was so incensed by this, he went back up to Upper Canada and horsewhipped the master. So the master in turn sued GTD2, and the fine was paid by friends of Charles. So,
The boys took a collection
yeah.
because they thought the master deserved it.
Yeah. Okay. So, yeah, the chapel. The chapel was built in 1930. This is Humber River limestone. It has been a bit of a problem for us because homeless people have tried to break in. We used to have wooden doors on it. They've now been replaced with steel doors. There's a slate roof, copper eaves troughs, fencing around the outside. So on the inside, if you have a look here, some of you may have difficulty climbing the stairs, but you'll see there's a bunch of pews in there. And Tom and Brian Ross kindly located these pews and had them put in there, but we have a real dust and cement dust problem, so it's a little difficult to deal with. There used to be a hole in the floor, and that hole had a grate on it. And the idea, the way it was designed was that in the wintertime, if you had a burial, this is before, hydraulic machinery and so on, you would file in here, have your service, and they would leave the casket there, and then it would be lowered down and to the basement where there's a big table, and that's where they performed the graveyard. No. Anyway, it was there, and the idea was that then, of course, in the springtime, through the back door, you would carry the tug, and the hole would be manually dug to bury the coffin. I don't believe it was ever done here, but that was designed to do that. So, where's Richard?
There was a wood top.
Yeah, we never had, never.
Not that I've seen in any of the records.
Yeah.
There was a wood top
Yeah.
over that,
Mm-hmm.
and that is now the dining room table at my cottage.
Oh my God. Well, and interestingly enough, as part of our bicentennial celebrations, we replaced the coat of arms, and the original one was so badly marred up by acid rain. I claim that, and that's at my cottage.
As are the old wood doors.
As are the old wood doors. I had a minivan at the time, and I came and got the wooden doors, and they are now in our master bedroom at my cottage. Because no one else wanted them, right? So I want to just talk to you about Richard Lippincott. He's over here. This is a fascinating story. I'll tell you the story about Richard Lippincott. He was loyal to the crown, and he served with the British irregulars in the American Revolutionary War. And in 1781, he discovered his brother-in-law was tortured by American forces. In a rage, he went out and found himself an American officer and hung him. This is 1781, known as Hangman Lippincott. Well, George Washington put a price on his head. So he had to, of course, get out of the 13 colonies in a hurry. So he went up to New Brunswick. And in 1791, he left New Brunswick for Ontario, and the ship he went on sank. And his wife was 9 months pregnant. The two of them were thrown into the water. She swam to shore, gave birth to her child in a fisherman's hut. So, and he was an example of one of the early UELs, the United Empire Loyalists. Now,
Where did the sinking take place? Where did was it coming up the St. Lawrence?
I believe it was off the coast of New Brunswick. I'm just not sure.
Maybe coming up.
Yeah.
And technically, he was one who was buried early on,
Yeah.
because he's actually not a descendant of Captain John.
That's right.
It's by marriage. So he's one of a very small handful of early settlers who are actually buried here.
So as Richard was mentioning, we had Captain John, George Taylor Denison, GTD2, GTD3s further down. So all the Denisons typically occupy. This is Denison country all through here, right? George Taylor Denison is the son of Captain John, and that is this pointy one right here. He served under Sir Isaac Brock in the War of 1812. He defended Fort York in 1837 from the William Lyon Mackenzie Republicans. He outlived 3 or 4 wives, had many children, and at death he owned 536 acres of land in the Queen and Ossington area, and that's one of those orange areas that you saw. Keep up with him. GTD2 settled in Gresham, Toronto, had 8 sons and 3 daughters. Busy man. Was a lawyer and loved farming, and he started developing his lands for Toronto expansion, and Russell Road is named after him. So then we're going to walk down here and find GTD3. Does anybody know the significance of the broken pillar?
I do. You breaking the children?
No. No. Captain Edgerton Denison, youngest son of Colonel George Taylor Denison, and they talk about him. I believe he died on board a steamship called the Vancouver, 1880, 1886. So he couldn't have been a captain. But anyway, the idea is with these columns, when they're broken, it signifies that somebody died before their time. So the time being defined as, well, back then probably the 50s, you're an old man, But anyway, so he died before his time.
So that was purposeful?
That's purposeful.
I've always thought it was just rock.
No, that's it. So,
Wow.
The other interesting stone, Tim, just back here, is we actually had a general, a major
oh,
general.
I was going to talk about that.
Okay.
Septimus Julius Augustus Denison was an interesting character. He served in the Boer War, and when the First World War broke out, he requested to be transferred to the British Army, because the Canadian Army was very small at that time. The whole country was very young. And of course the paperwork went back and forth between the British authorities, and he wrote on it S.J.A. Septimus Julius Augustus Denison, and they wrote back and said, well, we need your full name. So he wrote back and he said, okay, so my name is Septimus Julius Augustus Denison. They wrote back and said, in such times of national emergency, this levity will not be tolerated. So nobody could have a name like that. So that's one of the more colorful characters. George Taylor Denison III. Interesting guy. He attended Upper Canada College, Trinity College. In that Trinity College, he was expelled for rudeness. I almost got expelled from Upper Canada for doing that. Right? Anyway, he was an ardent loyalist, sympathetic with the Confederates in the U.S. Civil War. He actually met Robert E. Lee, and his home in Hayden Villa, which is on the map, became a known meeting place for Confederate agents. Because you got to remember, Canada was British, and the Brits were sided with the South against those nasty Republicans of the North, right? So in 1868, he wrote The History of Cavalry, and he won a prize from the Tsar of Russia and received 5,000 rubles. And you can, I think you can still look it up, it's around somewhere, right? He's a founding member of the Canada First Party, fought against the Fenian raids. The Fenians were Irish folks out of the U.S. who are sympathetic to the Irish cause, and so they mounted some raids into Canada, big national emergency and all that. He also fought against the Louis Riel Rebellion, served on the City Council of Toronto as a magistrate in 1887, and he was known as Le Beak. He had a big nose, and that's, I guess, where I got this.
And also it was 30 days Denison.
30, oh, everything was 30 days. That's
Yep.
right.
And it was told that it was said that he didn't know much about the law, but he knew quite a bit about the administration of justice. 30 days.
Oh, yeah. Frederick Charles Denison fought in the Fenian raids again, and at 40 years old, get this, he received a request from the British government, and at the time of Queen Victoria, and you can imagine this now, the Victorians sitting around saying, we have this problem in Khartoum, General Gordon is about to be annihilated by those nasty Sudanese, so Canada has rivers, therefore they must have voyagers who know how to paddle up rivers. You gotta remember the Nile was a big river, there were no dams, so let's call on the colonies to send the Canadian Expeditionary Force to relieve General Gordon at Khartoum. Totally ridiculous, right? So by the time they assembled a force in Montreal and they sailed off, and they got, I guess they went to London first, then they finally got down to the Suez and so on, and of course arrived late. General Gordon was dead, so they had to turn around and come back, and cholera struck. He almost died on the way back, and it was a total failure, and he was later decorated by Queen Victoria for it. So I told you about Septimus Julius. Oh, Admiral John is this neat one here. Admiral John Denison was the first Canadian to fly an admiral's pennant in the Royal Navy. He commanded royal yachts with the royal family. He would come to Canada every 2 years to visit Firebrand Island in Muskoka. Now the story goes, because he's an admiral, that he was on one of his visits to Muskoka. He had his launch, and he was trying. It must have been a windy day, and he had a great deal of difficulty landing the launch. Probably banged into the dock a couple of times, and the family was greatly relieved, because by then he was a little older, that they rejected his request for service to be in the World War I Royal Navy. They figured if he can't land a launch, he's not going to be put in charge of one of our destroyers. So, Robert Britton Denison,
He's way down there.
way back there. I already missed him. Son of GTD2, financed the construction of St. Stephen's Church in Toronto. Served as an alderman for the Toronto City Council. Just two more right over here. My Uncle George. He was a World War I fighter pilot. I remember him, and when I was a little boy, when he, well, no, not so little, fairly young when he died. Oh yeah, 1960, I was fairly young. Mary Rose Ross, his daughter, it's quite tragic. She suffered a lot of mental issues and so on, and she was a parachutist, and she jumped out of an airplane, and the chute didn't open. So she died parachuting. So that was my cousin Mary. Over here, Mary Kirkpatrick. Interesting. Married twice. Once to Edward Austin Hamilton Martin, who's buried over there.
No, he's not.
Sorry, he's buried elsewhere. We have a marker for him. She followed her husband, Edward Austin Hamilton, in the First World War over to France. You got to remember, the Germans got to within about 30 miles of Paris. And so she stayed at, I think it was the Maurice Hotel, if I'm not mistaken. And the story goes is that she served as a nursing aide and couldn't take it because of the horrific wounds that soldiers received in the First World War. So she either was pushed out or left of her own volition to come back. So she shipped out to Canada via New York on the Olympus with 4 destroyer escorts. She's thinking, this is pretty good. I got 4 destroyer escorts. But what she didn't know was they were there because the British ambassador, newly appointed British ambassador to the United States, was on her boat. Anyway, 4 passenger ships that went there, hers is the only one that survived the U-boats. Right? And often said her biggest disappointment was not being asked to dance by the Prince of Wales. The infant son, over here, can hardly see it. This was her infant son. He died only months. We think it was on the front doorsteps, and it probably was SIDS, but nobody's really sure about that. And that is it for me. I just wanted to pick up some of the more interesting stones for you. So,
An apartment block and townhouses. There's a path that goes down through an opening down to the Humber River, down at the very corner, which is nice for getting a little tour of what's going on. And there's also a hospital, my mind's out blank. West Park Hospital, which has been there almost forever, since the early 1900s, and was actually one of the first hospitals in the area to treat TB. So that whole area down there has been there for quite a long time. The space in between wasn't so good. Now it's not cleaned up. There is an empty lot there. If anyone's thinking of cemetery expansion. We did talk about the survey that, earlier, and walk through the branches and how it's laid out. And I do think that's an important part of the cemetery, but it maintains the family tree in the way the cemetery is laid out. And lastly, Tim talked about the bicentennial, and Tim was really instrumental. He said part of the organizing committee. He was pretty instrumental in making a lot of things happen, along with my Uncle Dick, who's right there, Chris, his son, who was president at the time. And so there is a video that was made at the time, and with a lot of care and a lot of work that was done by you and your neighbor to actually make it. For a while, only the 9 minutes that we had of it was posted on our website for quite a long time. We have recently, thanks to Chris, found a full-length version of it that includes Tim doing his 30-minute walking tour similar to what we just did. Tim has not changed much since that video 28 years ago, as well as video of the celebrations, which, when you think about it, it's 28 years ago. There's a lot of faces that I recognize and see, like my mother and my sister, who are no longer with us, but also a lot of faces that have, in all cases, have aged gracefully. So it's worthwhile going to the website if you can get there and download that video and have a look and just sort of see some of the things that were done. The Lieutenant Governor Hal Jackman was with us for that and spoke to the scene for a while as well. So it was kind of a neat video. So with that, we will
And
thank
the horse
you.
guards were here too.
Yes.
And the horse guards. So with that,
Two of them.
anything else? Yeah.
Just one
Yeah,
last
two.
note. I don't know if you were going to talk about this. Sue, our property manager, actually came up with this idea.
Oh, the trees. Yeah.
Yeah, I think most of you know about Vimy Ridge, right? So there's oak trees there. There's an areas there, if you haven't been there, there's areas there that still has live munitions left over from the First World War. And so I don't know who, but somebody collected a bunch of acorns. And so the government of Canada has them, made them available to anybody who qualified, and we qualified. So we got some of these Vimy oaks. So they're planted. And Sue will have to tell you where they are. I suspect they're down there or that way. The idea is that, yeah, but I just thought it was a neat touch given our history, right? As so many Denisons served in both conflicts, that we're going to eventually have Vimy Ridge oak trees here. So that's it, folks. Let's go
Thank you.
eat.
Let's go eat.